Today, it's a lot of interpretation, focused complexity that I will present to you. 16 states allow medicinal usage of marijuana. But as you all know, the federal raids in California after the Proposition 215, busting of the dispensaries, and now we have more battle lines being drawn. In Montana, there is a law in effect. So it's a combination of voter ballots, the favorable initiatives that are being passed, and the legislations that are being passed through the state legislators are coming in conflict with the federal power. So indeed, the states are in a collision course. And why is this so? Because of the sweeping generalization and the broad power that the Controlled Substance Act has. Under the Controlled Substance Act, marijuana falls on Schedule 1. And Schedule 1 is more encompassing, allows federal power to come in and criminalize simple acts of few ounces. So the question is, which one we want to focus? Decriminalize, and if we decriminalize, if we are walking in that trajectory, what are the specific circumstances? What are the specific acts that need to be decriminalized? So who has the power to regulate? Now, since this morning, we are hearing Gonzalez versus Reich. Professor Medler also talked about it, and we are not going to be able to escape Gonzalez versus Reich. And I will give you some more interpretation why Gonzalez versus Reich is important to understand the dichotomy between states' rights and federal rights. I don't want to take you through a basic constitutional law class, but this conflict is premised on the interacting ability of two specific clauses. As I go along, you will see there are three pillars, if you will: the Commerce Clause, the Supremacy Clause, and the 10th Amendment. Their interaction gives us this conflict. And at the end of the day, if there is a solution, it has to come also through finding specific areas, specific coterminous areas between the states' right and the federal rights. So Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. That's a very simple statement. But in this simplicity, because of the Supreme Court interpretation, Professor Medler mentioned that Supreme Court, over the last several decades, at times expanded the overreach of Commerce Clause and at times shrunk that power, creating, in the words of Milton, confusion worse confounded. And what we see in the law in one word, or the state of law, the interaction between state and federal, is a mess. Why is this so? Let's come back to Gonzalez versus Reich. Like I said, you cannot escape. But let's understand the justice's rationale for giving this decision. We heard about controlling intrastate commerce. So here, they go back, pick up a 1942 case of Wickard versus Filburn. This is a wheat crop case where in a local area, someone is cultivating wheat, and the justices in 1942 ruled that this localized cultivation, taken in its cumulative effect will impact interstate cultivation. It's a law and economics taken to its logical, unintended extreme. Now we apply that into marijuana cultivation. So let's look at the discordant issues. Wheat crop, marijuana crop. Wheat crop, essential commodity. Marijuana, let's just say 30% smoke pot, right? Even taken in that broad statistics, you cannot equate the two. So we have to keep in mind why the holdings in Gonzalez versus Reich perhaps ripe for overturning, or in perhaps ripe for taking specific exceptions out of it. And the fundamental holdings are that federal government can prohibit intrastate, even the Commerce Clause grants regulatory power on interstate commerce. So they are taking the intrastate prohibitory ability into there. How? Because the justices said that Congress has a rational basis to understand and connect from intrastate to interstate. So, what are the other specific ways federal regulatory authority can preempt state laws? Go back to the supremacy clause. In the event of a conflict, so we have various states now, more than 2/3, are going through various types of regulation, where they're focusing on cultivation, distribution, means of delivery. So this whole marijuana debate needs to be understood in its encompassing complexity. You have the cultivation aspect, distribution aspect, the delivery aspect. All these must be encapsulated within whatever specific statutes that the state legislatures want to pass. It is not as simple as putting an initiative in a ballot through the regular voting process. So, taken together, Gonzalez versus Reich, I'll just make it very simple, and the Constitution's Article 6, Clause 2. These two together gives a broader trajectory of the supremacy clause. And in result, it gives within, focusing on this marijuana debate, it gives a broad federal authority under the Controlled Substance Act. But the problem is it's complicated. The whole preemption issue is not so clear-cut. Why? After Gonzalez versus Reich, there was Gonzalez versus Oregon, and in there, focusing on the Oregon Death and Dignity Act, the court did not dispute the power of the federal court, federal government. And also that statute did not give the US Attorney General a broader authority to basically preempt Oregon's Assisted Suicide Act. So what are we seeing? The court expands the broader overreach of Commerce Clause in Gonzalez versus Reich, only to pull it back somewhat in Gonzalez versus Oregon. And that's where we see the tension. So let's now take a look at the specific instance. Given we are working in some sort of fuzzy interpretative paradigm, it depends on that particular issue, how the justices will rule, right? But through all these, there is a common trajectory that we see. This is what I call the trajectory of the preemption. So preemption can occur under two broad scenarios. Explicit purpose has to be defined within that particular law. For example, Controlled Substance Act. It can be argued whether there is any specific purpose in terms of prohibition of medical marijuana, or even any prohibition of decriminalization. So question is, does that particular legislation has explicit purpose? That's the first test. And the second, if there is no specifically articulated purpose, we seek implied intent. And implied intent is to be understood through, again, a conflict or a field test. Conflict comes in if there is a strong conflict between the state law and the federal law. Or it could also be a particular state law, when enacted, does it become an impediment to some congressional purpose, or for the full application of any federal statute. Now, these areas is eliminated by several case laws. For example, English versus General Electric, it's a 1990 case, clearly articulates that explicit purpose must be defined by the Congress. But even after that, even if there is an explicit purpose defined, there is another test that we must go through. This federal law, even if contains express preemption, it has to have a scope and substantive test. Scope, how far the reach should go. Substantive, whatever is the focus of that statute, does it conflict with whatever is the intended purpose or the act by the state? In this case, you can say usage of medicinal marijuana. Then comes in, once you get past and see there is no explicit purpose, then you test, see if there is no conflict or state law is not posing any hindrance to federal law. Then there is a field test, which is the field preemption is Congress or the federal law coming into an aspect of states, an area where it is specifically reserved for states' activities. Police power. Same thing could be said about these various immigration acts that are sweeping through the southeastern states. SB 87 in Georgia, Arizona's law, are these state laws. But if federal government come in and pass a comprehensive immigration reform, could we say now federal government coming into an area which is specifically reserved and specifically regulated by the state? So you can see that things are really can get very confusing based on interpretation and precedence. And again, in all these conflict scenarios, there has to be a presumption that Congress is not stepping into the basic building block of federalism. They are not intending to strip states' power. And White versus Levin, 2009, it's an instrumental case on this issue, setting up this specific boundary. So this is again continuing on this theme, our focus of the law, federal law, that is coming as a hindrance to all this state-sponsored marijuana-related laws is the CSA, the Controlled Substance Act. How much time?
Go ahead. I'll let you know.
But the problem is the language. Other speakers have said, and I am also very focused on this issue. These are not simple issues. This cuts along multiple dimensions. You have an entire chain from the cultivation, growing, distribution, regulation, and if it gets to that level, taxation. So it's a broader panoply of specific areas that need to be understood. Does CSA contain such explicit articulation to be able to preempt or prohibit state authorities? And if you look at this particular, I just picked up this small area. It says, no provision shall construe as indicating an intent on the part of the Congress to occupy the fields. So it's going back to that field preemption test under the broader implied intent of the Congress. And you can clearly see CSA does not have a specific intent in this area. So what's the focus should be? Last 7 minutes I talked about conflict and obstacle. How do we make sure when a state legislature go through the painstaking process of making sure all the bases are covered? They need to make sure that any part of the law does not present an obstacle to any existing federal law. And they need to also ensure that there is no conflict between two parts. So if we avoid conflict, we do not become beholden to the supremacy clause. And by taking care of the obstacle, we can also eliminate the overarching encroachment of the Commerce Clause, because that's the one justices in the last 90 years history have come in and either expanded or shrunk the Commerce Clause power. So, not so simple. It may be confusing, but definitely it is subject to interpretation. And how do we eliminate, how do we not be taken hostage to this interpretation? Specific language. And there are few Supreme Court cases, and bottom line is the same. Really, I want to go through this part real quick. A lot of times I am asked the question, what do we think Supreme Court will do? Well, it depends. Given the history of the Supreme Court, they are going to go into a narrow decision making, unless it's a Citizens United revisited. But given where the various state laws are, looking at the horizon, we see perhaps no Supreme Court cert will be given until 2013. And by the time 9 wise men get together, it's going to be 2014. plenty of time for the states to come up with appropriate statute. Now, there is, however, some things that could come, like unique federal interest. There is a particular case, interesting, where the justices came in and said, when there is a conflict between the federal and the state, unique federal interest can completely preempt the state's interest. Well, that was a military contractor-related case in Boyle versus United Technologies. Clearly, we are not anywhere near in these medicinal marijuana. Now we talked about conflict, state law, federal law, Commerce Clause, Supremacy Clause. What does the 10th Amendment say? It's as old as the Federal Republic, right? But if we look at 10th Amendment and the Commerce Clause together, it's not prohibited to the states, reserved to the states. All these are coming from the rights that can flow from the ballot initiative when a particular state passes an initiative with overwhelming 2/3 majority. That's where comes in 10th Amendment guidance. I think we're going to end with a very interesting and very touching, let me read that, from Reich and Gonzalez. Federal law is blind to the wisdom of future day, and the right to use medical marijuana may be deemed fundamental liberty issue, Lawrence versus Texas, already settled law. I do not know if there is any alternative to marijuana for these excruciating pain. But if there is nothing, no alternative, I think it's time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks, everybody. I'm Kevin Sabet. Left the White House in September. I was a senior policy advisor at ONDCP. I'm really happy to join you today. I want to thank Wayne State University Law School, Jessica, Mike, and other students who had a big part in putting this together. I know from a very long time this has been planned for quite a while. Professor Hall, of course, Professor Sedler, for inviting me here today. And I'm excited to get into a discussion during the Q&A. I'm sure there'll be some, we could have a lively discussion, let's put it that way, on many of these issues. And this morning I'm going to focus specifically on the legalization issue, which I think this panel is titled, and I'll stick around for the afternoon and get into the medicinal marijuana issues, which when we'll talk about the science and the FDA and medical properties, et cetera. But I'm just going to go through a couple of the arguments about why we, when I was in the administration, adamantly opposed legalization, and why President Obama has said over and over again why he does. But also I'll talk a little bit about really more from a policy perspective than a legal perspective. I'm a policy analyst, not a lawyer. And when I heard the astute presentation from Sabi on all the different legal theories and legal cases, I was reminded why I certainly wouldn't have been smart enough to go to law school. So bear with me here as we talk about more of the policy angle. And I want to also debunk some myths that are often discussed when this debate is put out there. This is obviously a very emotional debate for a lot of people. On the one hand, you have people who have lost kids to drug abuse, many of them starting with marijuana, and on the other hand you have advocates and others who have used marijuana themselves for 50 years and are living proof from their perspective that it's really a harmless drug and should be legalized. So I'll go through a couple of these arguments. First to understand is that no modern nation has ever legalized marijuana. So there have been experiments in the Netherlands on where technically marijuana is still illegal, but it's sold sort of with a wink and a nod in coffee shops, although where the sellers, these coffee shops, receive marijuana, I mean, that's an illegal act that's basically not enforced. There's a formal non-enforcement policy. For example, in Portugal, a lot has been talked about their sort of new policy from 2001. The reality is, if you look at the statistics from before or after that policy was enacted, there's really been very little change in the number of people arrested or imprisoned for drug use generally, but certainly for marijuana. And it is certainly the case that in most Western countries, people are not serving prison time for marijuana possession only. So in terms of folks that are only in there for having small amounts of marijuana, it's not a priority on the local, state, or federal level because clearly that would take a long time and a lot of prison space to round up everybody who's simply using marijuana and doing nothing else. So I think there's certainly a myth out there that is really contrary to the justice statistics when you look at who's in state prison, local jails, and of course federal prison or state jails for marijuana possession only. Many are there for marijuana and other crimes. Many people are arrested for marijuana possession. Most of them are released on their own recognizance, or they have to report to a judge, an administrative judge that basically is an equivalent to a parking ticket. That isn't to say that arrest can't have a negative impact on folks. And what I try and argue is that we really do need more balance in our drug policy. That on the one hand, sort of reefer madness, just say no, may not be applicable today. But on the other hand, legalization really presents an extreme solution to something that we need to improve upon our current policies and make our current policies better, take away the bad parts of our policy and accentuate the good parts. So I think when we think about what would happen under legalization, we can look to our two legal drugs, which are, of course, alcohol and tobacco. We can also add prescription drugs in there, too, but for purposes of this argument, we'll talk about alcohol and tobacco. And if you look at the use of alcohol and tobacco, we know, first of all, that alcohol and tobacco are used in far greater numbers than any of the illegal drugs, including marijuana. And that's because its use is promoted, it's commercialized. You have companies that certainly profit off of other people's addictions. When you hear, it's funny, I'm sure we'll hear it during the Super Bowl, the beer ads that talk about, after the end of every beer ad, they say drink responsibly. Well, if those companies really meant that they wanted you to drink responsibly, they would basically be saying, drink responsibly and put us out of business. Because the alcohol industry makes no money off casual drinkers. They only make money off the drinkers who drink heavily, and the same as with tobacco. That would certainly be the case under legalizing any drug, marijuana or anything else. You would have that heavy promotion, because promotion is really what leads to profit. Certainly the commercialization aspect as well. Especially in a land here in the U.S. where the Supreme Court has said adamantly that commercial speech is free speech. And so the idea that we would be able to limit that, I mean, obviously with tobacco that is somewhat limited. By the way, tobacco is used obviously in far greater numbers in overall general population than marijuana. But tobacco has been somewhat limited, but we still see advertising, certainly for alcohol. We know for sure that legalization would increase use. I mean, that's an uncontroversial assertion. We know that prices would drop dramatically. RAND just did a study over the summer, and many of the authors are, in fact, for other reasons, in favor of decriminalization or a softening of marijuana policies. But those authors, I think we're going to take questions at the end. Those authors at RAND have, did their economics analysis and found that price would certainly drop dramatically under legalization. Now, no one can really offer a reliable estimate on what that increase might be. So you'll hear a lot of people from the more extreme corners of the anti-drug community saying, well, it's going to, we're going to have a 10,000% increase in marijuana use, and everyone's going to be, zombies. And on the other hand, on the legalization side, we have folks saying, really, if cocaine was legalized tomorrow, would you use it? And of course not. So don't worry about it. It's not really going to increase use. The law doesn't have an effect on people's use or on norms. But what we have seen is clearly that the law is connected to people's use of the drug. It provides a sanction, provides a reason for a lot of people not to use drugs. And so we know that legalization would increase use. This is just a small graph from last year looking at the percentage of Americans who use alcohol, cigarettes, and marijuana. This is the population over 12. The alcohol numbers are skewed because, of course, obviously there are 12-year-olds that use alcohol, but it being 21 and over, if you really look at the sort of 21 to 65 population, the alcohol number goes up to about 75%. Cigarettes have remained consistently around 25%, although since the 90s, we've seen a reduction in youth cigarette use. That is increasing, by the way, over the last couple of years. So the sort of anti-cigarette campaigns that were adamant and were, in my mind, responsible for a decrease in the late 90s and early 2000s, we're seeing a reversal of that, and that's certainly troubling. But regular marijuana use stands at about 6.5%. These are people that, when surveyed, household surveys respond that they used in the last month. The other argument we hear often is that, if we would legalize, we would get rid of the black market and the underground market. And certainly the issues going on in Mexico clearly are, at the sort of emergency stage that we need to be thinking about new solutions in Mexico. And I agree with that. But to offer the solution that legalization is then going to, get rid of the black market and certainly put a dent in Mexico, really is not in line with the evidence with what is actually happening in places like Mexico and what cartels are making their money off of. Because we know that these are mixed markets. We know that the vast majority of the profits in Mexico are not from marijuana. They're from expensive drugs. They're from cocaine. They're from heroin. They're also from, by the way, kidnapping and extortion, which, in the last 10 years has been used as a tactic for profit for many of these cartels, which is new. It used to be sort of used as leverage and political kidnappings, et cetera. And now it's profit oriented. That's very new and very troubling. The piracy issue, clearly the human trafficking issue. So the idea that these cartels that are mixed in with so many other things, marijuana does provide somewhat of a revenue source for them, but the idea that these cartels are then going to go away after we legalize marijuana, I think is just not looking at the facts. Even the idea that smaller growers in the US, because obviously California provides most of the marijuana to the state and regionally in that area, I think it's an open question whether those folks would go away. I mean, it depends on the taxation. Obviously, if it's taxed heavily, we'll see less incentive for the underground market to go away. Of course, if it's not taxed, and that's really what the argument has been for state legislators, is you can make a lot of money off this. If it's not taxed, then we really do start worrying about the youth levels of use and about kids using marijuana, which is a serious issue. I mean, this is, when you look at the link with mental illness, 10 years ago, you couldn't say a lot of the things that the UK, that the AMA, that the American Public Health Association has been saying on the link with cognitive behavior and learning, on the link with the respiratory system, on the link with mental illness. And I'm not going to go through those studies here. I'm happy to provide them to anybody. But that would be a concern, even if you're not so concerned with adult levels of use. So when we talk about the taxes, and again, we can look at alcohol and tobacco if we want to say, let's try and say that tax revenue would be a reason to legalize marijuana. Well, we get, in today's environment, of one of the highest level of tobacco taxation that we've ever seen in this country. States and the feds receive about $25 billion a year, and that's from 25% of Americans using tobacco, by the way. We spend, unfortunately, the cost of tobacco onto society, mainly through healthcare costs and other indirect costs, come to about $195 to $200 billion. So about a tenth is what the tax provides us, about a tenth of the social cost. The number is very similar for alcohol. Actually, alcohol we receive less taxes on, even though it's used in such a prevalent way, and that's not an accident, by the way. Being in Washington, knowing the influence of the alcohol lobby, you better believe that their number one priority is to make sure taxes don't go up, because we know with alcohol, tobacco, and illegal drugs, it's well established that price dictates use. There's an elasticity and there's a sensitivity with price, especially for kids. So the alcohol industry, the last thing that they want to see are more taxes on alcohol, and they've been very successful in keeping alcohol taxes low. So if you actually adjust for inflation, our alcohol tax today in the US is about at Korean War levels. And that's not an accident. That's a well-organized, multi-billion-dollar lobby in Washington. And whether we're talking about marijuana or any other drug, doesn't seem to be a compelling reason why we'd want to create another industry like that or another big tobacco, which we know would happen under legalization. So we get about $15 billion a year from alcohol tax. It's really a crime if you think about it. And we spend about $215 billion on its social costs. In fact, alcohol is connected to violence and connected to emergency room mentions and connected to all these sort of negative health consequences way more than drugs like even crack and methamphetamine are, just if you look at the prevalence and how they're connected. So this argument that, well, alcohol is worse than marijuana, so that would mean we need to make our laws consistent. And last time I checked, consistency was not really a central part of any public policy, and nor does it necessarily need to be. I mean, alcohol is legal because of cultural reasons, and I'm not arguing for the prohibition of alcohol, even given those negative effects, but if you look at where alcohol is in our society, been around in terms of widespread use for the last, since at least the Old Testament. Now, I always have people saying, well, wait a minute, marijuana was around too, 7,000 years ago. We have, recorded date in China and in other places that marijuana was used. Well, yes, marijuana was used in limited circumstances, certain regions of the world, but there's no argument to say that it has been used to the extent and to the depth of alcohol, to say that marijuana is in our society like that so far. So I think if you ask most people in public health, and I have asked them, if they could go back 5,000 years and turn off the switch for alcohol from a public health perspective, they would certainly do so, given the effects on society. Right now, it would be very difficult, clearly, to make alcohol prohibited. We obviously tried that in the early part of the last century. Alcohol use, by the way, fell during Prohibition, and in fact, cirrhosis of the liver became a non-issue in the 10 years after Prohibition. Even people who are against Prohibition, like myself, that's part of it. Now, there were a lot of other negative effects, obviously, of Prohibition. But if you look at where alcohol is in our society, I see it as very distinct from marijuana and from the other drugs. It does give us an example, though, of legalization, and I think it is frightening to look at what happens when you legalize a drug. You have a big tobacco, peddling this onto young people. They need people to start early. It's in their incentive. And last time I checked, when we legalized the lottery, that didn't solve poverty. And neither did legalized gambling. So this idea that these taxes are going to somehow get back into education, we're going to have a new education system if only we legalize these drugs, it's a farce. It doesn't happen with alcohol, it doesn't happen with tobacco, and it certainly doesn't happen with other vices. I don't know why it would also then happen with marijuana. It's a good promise, but it's not with its evidence. And I think it's very important to say, and this point is not emphasized by people who are against legalization, and that's why oftentimes I annoy the sort of anti-marijuana crowd as well, is we do have a problem with incarceration in this country. I mean, we have a problem with the fact that the U.S. leads the world after Russia and China as industrialized nation with the highest rates of incarceration. I mean, that is an issue, and that's a problem. That's a problem for state budgets. It's a human rights problem, and it's a problem certainly in the administration that we were very focused upon, and that's why we cut the mandatory minimum with crack and cocaine. That's why we've been taking, when I was in the administration, taking a lot of heat from conservative Republicans on reentry programs, and also on, and unfortunately I missed the former AG's speech today, but on, for the first time, including addiction as an essential part of the healthcare package in ACA, which was a landmark in the addiction world. We do need to reduce incarceration, and we do need to have come up with much better ways for dealing with drugs on the whole in society. Right now, and this is a bit of a diversion, but I think it's important from a legal perspective. Right now, we deal with drugs really in a fashion that I would label as random and severe. If you happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, doing the wrong thing, you are caught for drugs and a lot of other things, it is you sort of can roll the dice in terms of figuring out what's going to happen to you. You get a sympathetic judge, maybe you'll get a pretrial diversion program or a treatment program. You get an unsympathetic judge, he hands you down a mandatory minimum 5 years. You're on probation and you fail your drug test for the first 5 times, your probation officer may look the other way, the judge may say there's really no room in our county jail system to put you to jail. Another judge in the neighboring county says, you violated your probation, my hands are tied, you're getting a year. And that's certainly not the way we want to go. Obviously, if you want to deter anything, that's the opposite of what you want to do, random and severe. You need swift, certain, and modest sanctions. And that's what I've been really advocating for. The Hawaii model, Project Hope, actually does that basically with drug offenders. It asks them if they want treatment or or not. If they don't want treatment, they really spend 2 to 3 days in jail for their probation violation. They're released, but they have to call a phone number every day to see if they're up for being drug tested. They have to report to the State House if they test positive. The process, the judicial process, has been wonderfully downstreamed in that it is sort of compact. You see the judge right then and there. You get your swift sentence, but it's modest. It's not a mandatory minimum. And they've seen a reduction in methamphetamine by over 75%. And many of those people didn't even go to treatment. It was the threat of incarceration. It was the threat of 2 to 3 days of jail. My wife's going to kick me out of the house if I go to jail. I'm going to lose my job. We all know the person that stopped smoking cigarettes, tobacco cigarettes, because their girlfriend was going to kick them out of the house. We all know the president, in fact, our last president, who stopped drinking, not because he went to a treatment program, because his wife said, I'm going to divorce you unless you stop drinking. Now, that doesn't work for everybody. Addiction is, and I certainly believe this, a public health disease. It's a problem. It's a health problem, and it needs to be dealt with treatment. But it's a biobehavioral problem. I mean, there are other things at play here. It's not exactly diabetes. It's not exactly heart disease or hypertension. So there are innovative, interesting ways and things we can do to lower drug use, also lower incarceration, without legalizing on the one hand and opening up markets and sanctioning that in society, and also without filling our prisons. And I think that's what is important to advocate for. And I'm never clearly, I mean, again, we look at the harms of marijuana. Of course you can't compare them with cocaine, heroin, or even alcohol. I mean, anybody who does that is not looking at the science. But there are certainly harms, especially for adolescents. And those harms have only been learned about really in the last 10 to 15 years. We can't ignore them. The public health community is talking about them all the time. We need to get that information out to parents and obviously focus on prevention. Legalization, to say that we could sort of legalize and then put that money into prevention, we've never done that before. I mean, even with the anti-tobacco, where some of the settlement money, which was settlement money from court cases, very unique case, went to tobacco prevention, that ran out in a few years. And now actually we're seeing tobacco going up. So I think that legalization is often presented as an alternative. I would argue it's really an extreme alternative, but we don't need to go that far. There are some things we can reform within our current system. We should obviously treat this as a health issue. I think we all would agree we want to prevent it among kids. But to sort of open it up to the open market, to commercialization, I think is a mistake, especially our current environment where sort of, people smoking marijuana in their own house really are, and not doing anything else, are not the focus of federal state enforcement. I mean, if you want to be smoking marijuana all day, growing it in your backyard, and you live out in the woods, and you're not getting in a car, going to the hospital, taking care of my kid, or doing anything that does affect me, God bless you, go for it. Have as much fun as you want. But we live in an interconnected society where for a lot of people that really isn't the case. They do have an employer. They do interact with the healthcare system, and we know marijuana exacerbates multiple health issues when seeing a physician. They do get in their car. We know the link with drug driving. So I would just say let's not expand that more than we have with our 2 legal drugs, which we certainly can't put the genie back in the bottle there. But let's look at this in an adult way, in a comprehensive way, and think about solutions that really would reduce use but also not infringe on civil liberties. So thank you very much.
Your turn.
Want this back? Or you want to just go for it? You may want to.
All right, so I'm Dan Riffle. I'm a legislative analyst with the Marijuana Policy Project in DC. As the professor mentioned, I was a prosecutor in Ohio before that. So I come at this at sort of a balanced perspective, much like Kevin does. First, I want to thank the law school and the Law Review and Jessica for having me here and for their generous hospitality. I also want to thank you for...
I don't think you want to. First time you've been giving a speech where it says legalization, no. It's a momentous occasion.
That's fine. I also want to thank the Law Review for scheduling me to go after Kevin, because obviously there was a lot of questionable assumptions there that I can go after in my material. Maybe we'll save that for the Q&A and have that lively debate. And on that topic too, if you guys could hold applause during the speech, let's keep it at a symposium and not let this become a debate or a rally. Let's just have the discussion and not get into advocacy too much here. That said, let's get into advocacy just a little bit. It's important that the law review chose this topic today because it's an important topic. I think there's a lot of people, there's a tendency on behalf of even people who support taxation and regulation of marijuana to sort of dismiss this as unserious or unimportant, and that's frustrating to me because it's wrong. Marijuana prohibition is a catastrophic public policy failure, one of the most catastrophic public policy failures of the 20th, and now, again, please, nope, just hold it. Now going into the 21st century, maybe going back since alcohol prohibition. And it's disastrous on a number of levels. Without getting too far into the arguments, we can talk about tens of billions of dollars wasted on enforcement with no impact on potency, no impact on availability. Every year, 80 or 90% of high schoolers report that marijuana is easy or very easy to get, so we're not even achieving our stated goals. We can talk about the erosion of civil liberties or the militarization of law enforcement, the distrust and disrespect for the law that a failed prohibition yields. But most of all, every day people die because of marijuana prohibition. Every day. They die in deals gone bad. They die in botched raids. This happened to an Iraq War veteran a couple months ago. Police die in raids on small-time users' homes. This happened in Utah earlier this month. Innocent people die in ill-conceived enforcement. Just happened last week here in Detroit. A young woman had a misdemeanor marijuana possession charge hanging over, and the police said, we'll go easy on you if you organize a sting operation and try to buy some harder drugs from your dealer. So she went along with that because she was scared of a conviction, and she ended up dying. The drug dealer killed her, burned her actually. It was a really gruesome case. And obviously if she didn't have a marijuana possession charge hanging over her, that's a decision she would have never made. And in fact, if she could have walked into a liquor store or a convenience store and bought marijuana in much the same way you or I might walk into a store and buy wine, she probably would have never met this person in the first place. But of course, that's just the deaths in this country. Kevin touched on the cartels. In the last 5 years, 50,000 people have died in Mexico. 50,000 people. That's on par with the number of people we lost in Vietnam. Now, like Kevin said, the cartels don't get all of their revenue from marijuana, but it's sort of interesting how the statistics have evolved on that. ONDCP used to say that the cartels get 60% of their revenue from marijuana. Back when they were trying to demonize marijuana, we contested that and said, well, why don't we take marijuana out of the equation by legalizing it and take that revenue away? All of a sudden, the statistics changed, and now today it's, oh, they only get about 12% of the revenue from marijuana. And I don't mean to attribute false motives there. Maybe it really did change. Maybe their business practices did evolve, and now they don't count on marijuana so much. But at the very least, that means they got started with marijuana prohibition, and that's what enabled them to get off the ground. And so all of this happens, again, because we've ceded control of a lucrative market to criminal syndicates. And that's bad public policy. And so I thank the Law Review for raising this topic today. So I'm going to talk today about tax policy. It's exciting, right? It's a very, very sexy issue. I saw a lot of eyebrows go up there. You might start thinking, well, what does tax policy have to do with the federal and state dichotomy? And the answer is really not much. I wrote these before I found out the title of the panel, but the good news is that happened a while ago, so I've had some time to sort of change my comments, and I'll make sure that we get into there. If not, we can do it a little bit in the Q&A. So why do I want to talk about tax policy? Well, the first reason is every day I have to talk about why we should legalize marijuana, and today I have a chance to talk about how, and frankly I get a little bit bored with the why, so I'm excited to get into the how. The second reason is that I think it's just a more interesting subject. Looking out at the audience here, I'm guessing that you're all here, so you're all interested. So I assume you're aware of the arguments. If not, I just laid out a few of them there at the beginning. Most of you have probably made up your mind already. And even those of you who are opposed to marijuana prohibition, statistics show many of you believe that it will be eventually taxed and regulated like alcohol. So it sort of makes more sense to start talking about how we're going to do that. The former Attorney General touched on that a little bit in his comments. When he talked about how if he is going to support the legalization of marijuana, he wants to make sure that the technical end is wrapped up. And tax policy is a big part of that. So we'll start with the power to tax is the power to destroy. That's McCulloch v. Maryland. A lot of you learned that in 1L. Interesting, the quote is attributed to John Marshall because he decided the case, but it's actually lifted from Daniel Webster, who argued it on behalf of the federal bank. So what does it mean? Well, it means that if you can tax something at all, then you can destroy it. And in this context, it means if you can tax marijuana, you can essentially prohibit it. In fact, that's how marijuana prohibition started with the Marijuana Tax Act. The federal government said you had to, in order to legally possess marijuana, it had to have a stamp on it saying you paid taxes. They didn't take any payments for taxes, and they didn't make any stamps. So essentially, marijuana was illegal at that point. Even today, with marijuana sort of quasi-illegal in the medical marijuana field, you see tax policy used to try and destroy it. The federal government doesn't have the law enforcement resources or frankly, the political capital to go in and kill the medical marijuana industry, so they try to use the tax code in various ways. Most notably Section 280E, which prevents businesses from deducting ordinary business expenses like payroll, like overhead. Dispensaries aren't allowed to do that because of Section 280E, which says you can't if you engage in trafficking of controlled substances. And that's been interpreted to apply to dispensaries. And even when marijuana is legal, the power to tax can be used to destroy. If you set $1 million tax on marijuana, you've essentially returned to marijuana prohibition because nobody's going to pay $1 million tax on marijuana. And it's, you know, to sort of segue a little bit, it's one of the reasons why I think it's a little outlandish when people like me who support taxing and regulating marijuana are branded as extremists or at one end of the spectrum, as Kevin did in an op-ed a little while ago. I mean, first of all, if you believe Gallup, a majority of Americans at this point actually support the taxation and regulation of marijuana, so it's, you know, by definition not an extreme position. But more importantly, you know, legalization sort of exists on a spectrum. It's not something that's either black and white, legal or not legal. When Kevin talks about legalization of marijuana and creating an explosive industry and something along the lines of alcohol, it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. We have the authority to regulate marijuana. We can, first of all, as I'll say today, we can employ high taxes. We can also prohibit advertising. We can pull a number of different levers to limit the size of that industry as it develops. And when you look at that legalization spectrum, you have, you know, prohibition here at one polar end of the spectrum. You have the libertarian, you know, wet dream of no taxation, no regularization on the other end of the spectrum. And tax marijuana, particularly highly taxed marijuana, which is what I favor, is actually closer to this end of the spectrum. And so Kevin and I are actually not that far apart. He's just a little bit more extreme. He's over at the one end there. But getting back to the tax issue, you know, we don't want $1 million tax because we don't want to get at the point where we're right back at prohibition. But we also don't want the tax to be too low because then we're not achieving some of our goals, which are to deter use of marijuana and also to collect revenue. So how high should it be? Well, before we talk about how high those taxes should be, we have to talk about how we're going to tax marijuana. We have to figure out what the base is. The most common way that people buy marijuana today is by weight. You go to your dealer, you ask for 1/8 of an ounce or an ounce of marijuana. And in fact, that's actually how we tax tobacco, so it makes some sense on one level to tax by weight. The problem is not all weights are equal. When you go to your dealer and buy, say, 1/2 ounce of high-grade marijuana, that might be $200, whereas 1/2 ounce of low-grade marijuana might be $100. So it's sort of complicated to tax marijuana by weight, more so than it would be for tobacco. So maybe it's potency. You know, maybe we tax by grade. In fact, that's actually how we tax alcohol. And we use the potency tax on alcohol to deter use of higher, more potent substances. So for example, the tax on liquor is actually higher per alcohol volume than the tax on wine and beer. And even at wine, the tax on 14% by alcohol content wine is actually lower than the tax on 21% content alcohol wine. So maybe potency makes sense. And in fact, that's actually been attempted. One of the few legalization bills that's been introduced was in Massachusetts. And they used a proposed tax scale of $150 or $200 or $250 per ounce based on whether the marijuana was 5% THC, 10% THC, or more than 10% THC. So what are the problems with potency testing? Well, the first is how do you homogenize the sample? You know, when I look at a bottle of alcohol, I can take 2 ounces from the top or 2 ounces from the bottom, and they're likely to have pretty much the same alcohol content. But when you're talking about plant matter, it's a little bit harder to homogenize that sample and figure out exactly what the THC content is because one part of the plant might be different from another part of the plant. And another problem is the expense. It's expensive to figure out the potency of marijuana. If any of you have tried, you know, as a hobby home brewing alcohol at home, you know that you measure the alcohol content of your beer relatively easily. You use hold on one second. Use a relatively cheap thing called a hydrometer. You measure the density, or more specifically, the specific gravity of the alcohol, and you can deduce of the beer, and you can deduce the alcohol content from there. With marijuana, you have to use a piece of equipment called a gas chromatography mass spectrometer, and those are tens of thousands of dollars. And so if you have a small government, a small state, or more precisely a municipality try to impose a potency tax, that's actually expensive for them to do. But I don't think it's a big problem because really, any sensible regulatory scheme will require labeling for potency. So at some point along the line, that's going to be done. The bigger problem I see with potency taxing is that marijuana doesn't always come in a leafy green bag. Marijuana can sometimes come in edible forms, in brownies. It can also come in tinctures or solvents that are dissolved in herbal tea or something along that line. And how do you measure that? How do you measure the potency of a brownie? Is it a big brownie or a small brownie? Is it a brownie with a lot of marijuana in it that's low potency, or a brownie with a little bit of marijuana in it that's high potency? So how do you do that? Well, one of the ways we can do around that is we can just tax by the price of the marijuana. You can do that with either a sales tax or a gross receipts tax. The easiest way would just be to charge, if the marijuana, say, costs $100 because it's low potency, well, then you owe 10%. If it costs $200 because it's high potency, you still owe 10%. And that way you're sort of taxing potency by proxy. Same thing with gross receipts. Doesn't matter what kind of marijuana you sell or how potent it is, you look at the gross receipts at the end of the month. If you sold $10,000 worth of marijuana products, you owe 10%. So that's one of the ways that we can do that. So that's the base. Let's talk about the rate. How high do we make those taxes? I mentioned some of the competing concerns here. One of them is raising revenue, another one is discouraging use, and another one is avoiding bootlegging. In fact, I think that's sort of one of the chief concerns, at least from my angle. You want the end price paid by the consumer to be high enough that you discourage use, but you want it to be not too high, because then you create the black market that Kevin mentioned earlier. And at that point, you start missing out on revenue, and you're not really deterring use. You're certainly not deterring safe use. So how high should it be? Well, we'll look at alcohol and tobacco, for example. Alcohol tax at the end product, at the end sale, retail point, accounts for about 20% of the sales price, according to most estimates. 11% if you look at watchdog groups or ONDCP like Kevin, about 30% if you look at the alcohol industry. So it's probably somewhere in between. And I would actually agree with Kevin that excise taxes on alcohol are far too low and need to be raised. For cigarettes, depending on state taxes, it can account for anywhere around 50% in western states with relatively low taxes, or if you go to New York City or Europe, you're looking at closer to 70 or 80% of the end price is actually paid in taxes. So what should it be for marijuana? Well, the RAND study that Kevin mentioned earlier, which has a host of problems that we can get into later, but they suggested a 58.6% tax, which is a remarkably precise figure, I would say. Another study that we commissioned that was done by a Harvard economist by the name of Jeffrey Myron suggests a 50% ceiling is really feasibly the highest tax that you can impose, and he actually used a 25% tax as the basis for some of his estimates. So what's the right answer? I don't know. We're going to have to engage in some trial and error to determine how that's going to work out, and that sort of brings us to my next point, which is who actually does the taxing, and this is where we start getting into the topic of the panel, the federal and state dichotomy. We're not likely to see the federal government tax anytime soon. Public opinion is at about 50% and growing, but that's not high enough for the federal government to start right away with legalizing and taxing marijuana. More likely what you'll see the federal government do is what somebody like a Rick Perry has suggested. He says, I'm not in support of the legalization of marijuana, but if states want to do that, then I'm okay with doing that. And that's sort of the Federalist Society, states are the laboratories of the democracy standpoint. I think this is a really good example of that. You want 50 different states employing a lot of different mechanisms, some with high rates, some with low rates, some taxing by base or by potency, some taxing by cost, some taxing by weight. And you can sort of let those experiments play out and play with the numbers and the margins, and eventually, over time, we'll find the number that works best. So it's just good policy to let the states go first and to build that flexibility into the law. And you've seen that also in some of the bills that have been introduced. The Massachusetts bill that I mentioned set up a board that could adjust those rates up or down. The initiative in Colorado that my organization is supporting sets an initial excise tax of up to 15%, but that's just for the first 5 years, and after that we hand the ball to the legislature, and the legislature can determine the rate from there. But of course the big elephant in the room and the real topic of the policy of the panel today, the federal and state dichotomy, is can states regulate marijuana? Can they tax marijuana? You're going to almost certainly need the permission of the federal government, at least if Gonzales v. Raich holds, in order for states to tax marijuana. You're all familiar with preemption. If not, we sort of laid it out earlier. But the bottom line is that states can remove criminal penalties for the possession of marijuana, but can they affirmatively facilitate that trade? Can they tax marijuana? Can they license businesses to sell marijuana? If the feds come in and say no, then I think we're at a troubling policy, because at that point, like I've said, states can remove criminal penalties, and that's where you get into the concern that Kevin has, which is where you have completely unregulated marijuana and a completely unregulated industry. So I think it's important for the federal government to do that, to allow states to move in to regulate and tax marijuana, and I think that's what we're likely to see. I also think it would be just incredibly unpopular for the federal government to come into a state, particularly a state like Colorado, which is a purple state, a swing state, so a lot of political implications there, and also a state that would enact by popular referendum to come in there and say, no, I know the majority of your citizens support this, but we're gonna come in and say, no, you can't do that. And then again, we wind up with this bad policy of completely unregulated marijuana trade. I'm doing okay on time, but I'll go ahead and move to the final thoughts. I'm eager to get to the Q&A. I think the overarching lesson here is that nobody really knows the answers for how to tax marijuana. As Kevin said, no Western modern government has actually legalized the substance and regulated it, so we don't really have any really good guiding examples to go from. We can take some ballpark guesses based on alcohol and tobacco, but it's going to be a trial and error process to figure out what it is. But the guiding philosophy, at least in the short term, should be to start low and then go high with the taxes. And I say that because the most important thing to do is to undercut that illicit market, to mitigate the public policy disaster that is prohibition and all of the detriments that that yields. So how do we do that? We do it with low taxes. I think there's sort of a presumption that we can start with the going market street rate as a base and say that, you know, if we remove the risk premium, you know, the risk, you pay so much for marijuana because 3 or 4 different chains of supply are breaking the law and risking jail time, and so that risk premium is what raises the price of marijuana. When you remove that and legalize it, the price will drop. So let's say it drops to $200 an ounce from $400 an ounce. Well, then you could impose a $200 excise tax, and you're right back at the street price we're at. So I think that sort of mitigates against Kevin's concern that the price will drop, but at the same time, it's important to undercut that illicit market and to do away with that. So I think you do that by starting with the low tax and then you go high. And there's some examples from alcohol that we can learn from here. When alcohol prohibition ended and Congress was contemplating the reimposition of taxes on alcohol, Roosevelt's advisors said that they should start low and go high, and that it would take about 3 years to eliminate the illicit market. It's surprising that it takes that long, but you have to remember prohibition was in place for about 15 years, and in that time, bootleggers and the black market had developed into a relatively sophisticated operation. So it did take about 3 years to undercut that, but you can look at the rates and see how long it took and how effective it was. In 1934, when the first tax was reimposed, it was reimposed at $2 a gallon, and then it went up to $3 a gallon, not until 1940, but then in 1942 it went up to $6 a gallon. In 1944 it rose all the way up to $9 per gallon. So it more than quadrupled in 8 years there. And we didn't see a return of the illicit market then. So once you completely break up that illicit market and you've gotten rid of the black market, then you can start raising those taxes and achieving those public policy goals, whatever we determine them to be it raising revenue or deterring use. So I'll leave it at that. I hope the tax policy discussion didn't bore anybody to death. I see you're all still breathing, so that's good. So thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. About 10 to.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today. It's an interesting topic, and I certainly have had a long interest research in marijuana and a few other medical things as well. If I can make this work. Yes, okay. It's especially an honor for me to be on this panel with Bob Sedler because, as he told you, I am a pharmacist and I graduated in 1975 from University of Michigan College of Pharmacy. And when I heard Mike Cox talking about walking the halls of Mary Markley, where I lived, and seeing bongs in every room, I thought it would have been he probably would have been much more impressed had he walked the halls of Mary Markley in about 1971 when every room had a hookah. And my graduation from University of Michigan and coming to law school here proves that you didn't need at that time to have a 3.0 to get in. But I got in and took constitutional law, and Bob Sedler was my instructor. And I have the pleasure of teaching constitutional law a little bit to my pharmacy students who have to understand this concurrent and dual jurisdiction, which is a very difficult concept for non-lawyers to understand. And whenever I am doing something on due process or freedom of speech, I very often think back to what Bob Sedler would have said, and then I say exactly the opposite. At any rate, I am really a fish out of water here today because you're supposed to be talking about the dichotomy of federal and state laws, and I'm here to talk to you about the medical aspects of marijuana use. First thing I want to introduce you to is the concept of pharmacognosy. This is a discipline that is focused exclusively on the human and the active ingredients of, in humans from natural plant resources. You would not believe how often people will call me up and say, I need a pharmacologist to testify in a case. And I say, I'm not a pharmacologist, I'm a pharmacist. And people often don't realize that there's a major difference. Well, within pharmacy, there is another specialty called pharmacognosy. And this discipline studies active ingredients that are found in natural resources. And you can see up there a couple of very common things like digoxin that comes from purple foxglove, and caffeine that comes from Camellia sinensis, which is actually for tea, and coca plants, camphor for camphor tree bark, codeine from the Papaver somniferum, or more commonly called poppy seeds. Other natural resources that we get drugs from can include animals. And for any of you ladies out there that might be taking conjugated estrogens like Premarin, I don't know if you want to know this, but that comes from horse urine. The problem with marijuana, from my perspective, is we don't know what it is scientifically. We know that it has 400 different chemicals, and we know that it has a whole bunch of different kinds of what is called cannabinoids. But we don't know what those cannabinoids do. Some of these are common to you, and you've probably heard about delta-9 trans-tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, delta-8 trans-tetrahydrocarbinol, it's also called THC, but you probably have not heard too much about cannabichrome, or cannabidiol, or cannabidioxycolol, or tetrahydrocannabidiol, which are proves that 5 years of pharmacy school teaches me how to say weird things. There are also some synthetic cannabinoids that have been tested in laboratories that can show even about 500 times the strength of natural occurring marijuana. But what a lot of people don't ever talk about is the fact that marijuana plant contains a whole bunch of other things that don't get attention, like terpenoids or terpenes. Given the fact that people don't know about these kind of things or ever talk about them or the difference, that makes it not surprising me that we are one of the 16 states and District of Columbia that don't know how to spell marijuana. There must be a very large Latino community in Michigan, because that's the Latino spelling of it. No good science on the activities of the ingredients. There are a multitude of different kind of hemp plants from which marijuana is derived. The most common hemp plant is called Cannabis sativa, And then that has within it all those cannabinoids that I was talking about. But the type of cannabinoid, the quantity, the quality, all are affected by different receptors in the human brain. And more importantly, and often far less recognized, is that they also have activities on other organs within the human body that can affect what kind of things that the drug does. I'm sure you've heard of the cannabis sativa effect and the cannabis indica effect, and the indica comes from an effect on organs other than the brain primarily. But nobody knows that exactly for sure because we've never measured it, because the Drug Enforcement Agency and the FDA and the NIH will not allow any federally funded research on the compound. But as I mentioned, there's some other issues or other ingredients in there in marijuana that have some kind of effect. These terpenes, or terpenoids as they are called, there's at least 16 of them, and there is no scientifically accepted theory on how those terpenes affect the cannabinoids. And so what I wanted to do is sort of show you some science behind this kind of thing. Let's see if I can find something. Yes, there it is. This is probably boring to lawyers, as to how the tetrahydrocannabinol is bound to certain receptors, and that its measurement can be, or its effects can be measured, particularly in the lipid membranes of the neurons in the brain. And then just to give you some more boring stuff, and I guess I should have said that being on the faculty of pharmacy actually proves that you don't have to graduate in the top 25% of your class to get into pharmacy. Probably because Bob Sedler gave me a B or something. I forgot. It was too long ago, and he's too old, and I'm too old to remember that. He told me he didn't even remember me as a student, so I guess I didn't make too much trouble for him. Anyway, this shows that we do know exactly where the brain receptors are and some of the organs that we were talking about. The scientific fact that we do know is there's no doubt that the type of the plant, that is the variety, the weather, the soil, the time of harvest, and some other factors will determine the potency. And I believe that's what Dan was talking about, excuse me, is this potency issue, because the potency will vary greatly depending upon the conditions under which the product is harvested. There is some science that is accepted and known to exist with respect to marijuana, and Dan mentioned this when he mentioned gas chromatographs and how expensive they were to do. But this data is taken from a laboratory in Kalamazoo, Michigan, that is not operating with a license, and so we have to take that into effect as to whether or not this is an accurate description. But here are two very different samples. And you can see from the potency analysis that one of them has 0.7% of the CBD, which is one of the indica type drugs. The other one has 2.6. And you can see from the difference. You have a pointer on it? No? Okay. Anyway, if you look at the heights of those various components, what they're measuring is those terpenoids and the amount of THC delta 8 and THC delta 9. And you can see from the potency analysis that they have rather different profiles. But the problem is that there is also a whole bunch of junk science out there. And every time I come over here and people start talking about Reich versus Gonzalez and all that kind of thing, my hands get sweaty and I don't know what they're talking about. And I've tried to forget as much as I can. So I think it's the Daubert science test, and I get confused as well. It's really Dilbert because they're both sort of nonsensical. But anyway, here's taking that gas chromograph, looking at the terpenoids that are in it, and this person that did this graph makes a prediction as to what kinds of effects that particular sample is going to have. And just to compare that to a second sample, you can see by comparison that they have very different chemical profiles. And let me put them on top of each other just so that you can compare them. But when I tell you about, the quality of this junk science, we have absolutely no idea what the x-axis is, the one going up and down. And you'll notice that these samples actually use different indexes. One goes from 0 to 10, and the other one goes from 0 to 7. And we also don't have any idea what the description of the x-axis, which is the sleep, pain, high, diet, and all those effects, and what the percentages of those terpenols are. So yes, there is some junk science out there that we have to be very careful about interpreting. And as a person of science myself, I look at these things and sort of have a little bit of a laugh. I also have a little bit of a laugh when I hear some people talking about some of the issues with marijuana regulation, or what I think should be called decriminalization of medical marijuana, and the way that things are going with the closing of dispensaries, I think is probably not such a great idea, because then when you push the supply underground, you don't have any idea where it comes from. You have no idea what you're buying. There are thousands and thousands of different names for different strains, like Purple Haze and Gray Lady and all those kind of things. You don't know how it was harvested. You don't know where it was grown. You don't know the conditions of the soil. And more importantly, you don't have any idea if it's contaminated with molds or bacteria or with something else that could actually be harmful for you. But I have cringed a couple times today when some people talked about illicit drugs, and marijuana is among them. Marijuana is not a drug. A drug is something that is determined by the Food and Drug Administration to be an entity that can help in the cure, mitigation, or treatment of a disease. It is not a drug because it has never been classified as a drug. It's a controlled substance, and the DEA classifies it as a CS1, and there are not drugs in CSA1. It's not a drug of abuse because it's not a drug, and it is difficult to find that there are instances of abuse. And somebody mentioned the problem with gateway drugs, and I would submit to you that the problem with gateway drugs begins in your medicine cabinet, where your children take your Tylenol and your aspirins, and then graduate to your Xanax and then your Vicodins and Oxycontins. That's where the gateway actually starts. I have never seen any evidence of a scientific nature showing that people who take marijuana go on to use harder drugs because they used marijuana first. And I think Mike Cox even admitted that as well. So I just want to correct some of these misunderstandings. As terms of market regulation, I think that when we did have dispensaries, there was some sort of market regulation, because when a person wanted to buy medical marijuana with a medical marijuana card and it's authorized and all the legalities are taken care of under Michigan law, you would go to a dispenser, and if that dispenser gave you a product that was you felt to be worth the price and the effort to go through it, versus going to another dispensary or another supplier and getting things that were maybe more expensive and not near as effective for you or whatnot, there's this market force that kind of exists. It's a little bit like some of you like to buy your meats at Kroger's and some of you like to buy your meats at Meijer's. There's a market force that does some regulation. So we put those dispensaries out of business. When we learn and what we find is that there's no way of measuring any of the qualitative or quantitative effects. You have heard a lot of people talking about prohibition. I don't know if people just don't want to push the abortion button, but those are all things that have been pushed underground, and as we've seen or heard several times, they didn't work. A couple of things about prohibition, though, that I haven't heard anybody talk about is the fact that under prohibition, the people that made the most money were not the bootleggers and were not the speakeasies. The people that made the most money under the Volstead Tax Act that criminalized alcohol were physicians and pharmacists, because there was an exception in the law that said that if you were using alcohol, ethanol, for a legitimate purpose, it could be prescribed, and so you go to your doctor and you're prescribed spirit aqueous, and then you go to the pharmacy and you could buy different flavors of this spirit aqueous, and it was like gin flavor and whiskey flavor and scotch flavor and rum flavor and vodka flavor. And so if you had the money and the intelligence to do so, you could stay away from those speakeasies. And one of the problems that with the speakeasies was not so much that there's more or less alcohol being consumed, but one of the problems that we don't hear about very often with the speakeasies is that the brewers of the alcohol that was being sold illegal were not terribly sophisticated chemists and didn't know exactly what they were doing. And a lot of times the brewers would produce a product called methanol instead of ethanol. Ethanol is the alcohol that we drink, whether it be beer, wine, or liquor. Methanol is a different kind of chemical, and consuming it in moderate quantities causes acute, severe, chronic blindness. And so more people went blind under Prohibition than the decrease in cirrhosis of the liver. So I think that it's, when we look at the consequences of these things, it's also putting it in a context. I think you also should understand about the regulation of drugs and statutes, and know that drugs that we dispense in the pharmacy have to go through rigorous testing procedures by both the FDA, which is a product of the Health and Human Services Division, and is filled with scientists who look at questions as to whether or not the drug is safe and effective for its intended purposes, and the Department of Justice, which is filled with people that are more oriented toward police regulation and ask the question, does this drug have a potential for abuse? All of these drugs, whether they're controlled or non-controlled or prescription only, have to be made under certain sterile conditions. The drugs that I buy as a pharmacist have to come from FDA-registered distributors. We now are having a shortage of drugs. A lot of you have probably heard about, if not experienced, some severe shortages of drugs, and the creation of a sort of a gray market that we don't know where those drugs come from. Even if we do know where they come from, They may not be as potent as what they claim. I warn you, if you happen to be buying your drugs from Canada off the internet, to be very careful, because the vast majority of the drugs that are advertised on the internet as coming from Canada do not. They come from countries like Sri Lanka or some of the third world countries. And I've never figured out what a third world country is, because I've never heard of a second world country. But anyway, I just wish, caution you to be careful about these gray market drugs. And tests have shown that these gray market drugs have from 0 to 200% of their labeled quantity. And so you may be saving a few dollars by buying them online and having them imported from other places, but you're not necessarily going to get the quality or the pharmacological effect that you anticipated. When we get to the DEA, drugs that are recognized by the DEA are in Schedules 2 to 5. And it is important to understand that a pharmacist who is dispensing these drugs, not substances, drugs, and I know that there's going to be a few of you that say that that's a distinction without much of a difference, but I remember Robert Sedler said that at least 1,000 times in a year. But the distinction is very important, because it has to do with whether or not it's regulated and whether it meets these requirements. And we can account, especially for Schedule II drugs like the Oxycontins, the pharmacy has to account for exactly every single dose of those drugs. In the Schedules 3 through 5 drugs, we have to make rigorous attempts to keep records that are as accurate as possible, so that we know at any one given time where that drug has gone. I should mention to you also that pharmacists are required to take care to avoid diversion of drugs. And the fastest growing crime in terms of medical use of agents is thefts from drugstores and burglaries from drugstores. This is becoming a major problem. It used to be... Pardon me?
That happy note, we can end.
Okay. And just one final little thing. Can I have just 2 minutes?
Take whatever you want.
All right. Every time I come to the law school, I learn these little things that are boring. And so I thought, as a pharmacist whose job is to compound things, that I would show you how to make a tincture of marijuana, because tinctures of marijuana have become the fastest growing segment of the industry. And let me see if I can just take a quick here. Yes, there we go. You take Everclear alcohol, which is a grain alcohol, and you dump in a grain of your, or gram rather, of your product, and you shake it up a little bit. I bought this thing in Shipshewana, Indiana, at a flea market, and I don't really know what it's for. But anyway, you take it and you put it into a vial like this, and you mix it up, and you strain it, and then you pour it into a tincture bottle. And you'll notice with my great pharmaceutical skill that I am not pouring, that I'm not dripping, and that the product is going entirely into the bottle. And then you take this tincture bottle, and this is an eyedropper or a dropper for it, and you put it in a glass bottle. You don't want to keep it in a plastic bottle, because the cannabinoids will leach into the plastic, and they will not leach into a brown bottle. And then you have to put this in a safe place, usually a safe, warm place. Don't put it in your liquor cabinet or your medicine cabinet, because your kids will find it. So, my suggestion is just put it in a nice warm place where it stays with you. And after about 3 or 4 months, you take the tincture and place a couple drops of it under your tongue. And unlike the edibles and the Dobronil, which is a legalized form of THC, you get almost an immediate effect. And as opposed to having, so you avoid the problem that all the medical people have with smoking. So I hope that my demonstration here of these little bit of pharmacy have helped you understand and put into perspective what I have been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. On this really dramatic point, we may end. I want to thank all of our speakers for very exciting, very interesting, and very well-informed presentation. I think, Jesse, you and the organizers, Jessica, deserve a lot of credit for getting this group of people here. I also want to thank them for adhering to time limits. We have about a half hour or so. The question is, how do we want to use it? 1 minute, one thing we could do is have all of the panelists interchange with each other. We're not going to do that. Another thing we could do is that in the best spirit of John King, I could ask probing questions of each of the panelists that would produce a strong response. We're not going to do that either. I'm going to ask one question that the panelists may wish to answer briefly, and then I will turn it over to the audience. We know that Congress can expressly authorize state regulation, and that avoids the preemption. So Congress could get around Gonzalez versus Rake by saying, you, the states, may do this. My question to each of the panelists is, should Congress specifically expressly, do that again, should Congress expressly authorize state allowance and regulation of medical marijuana? And if so, what should Congress authorize? So you want to go first? 1 minute.
So the question is, should Congress authorize the states, right?
Right.
Well, I take the medical marijuana out of the entire marijuana debate, right? So you go through the, like I said, source of cultivation, you go through the distribution and the dispensing aspect of it, clearly delineate your source to the end game, and because you are legalizing it, what are the tax and other law enforcement structure? You have to input in there
But that should be in the authorization itself. Kevin, what would you say?
If the question is about medical marijuana, I think that we should just follow the same guidelines for medicine as we do for all drugs, and that is that it goes through the proper FDA procedure. We can ramp up the research. I think a much better solution would be for Congress to increase research into the cannabinoids and to the terpenes and the other components within marijuana in order to create, and we already have 3 marijuana-based medications legal today, in order to activate more research into the marijuana, medical marijuana issue. We don't vote on ADHD medicine in states. I don't think we should vote on marijuana as medicine.
So that if I get your answer correctly, the feds should not authorize state regulation. If anything is to be done, it should be entirely federal.
Well, yeah, I mean, it should be, if we're talking about medicine, it should just go through the medical process, not through the voter referenda that's, commercials and big money.
Dan?
So I would say that I actually agree with Kevin that it should go through the regular FDA approval process just like any other medicine, which is why I wish Kevin would support some changes to federal law that would allow that to happen. A lot of times we hear people say, oh, we can't allow medical marijuana because it's not FDA approved. Well, the reason is it's not really feasible to do under the current structure. Unlike any other drug, When you want to do research, you just go through any number of approved channels to obtain it, and you submit your proposal and you do your research. With marijuana, the federal government has a monopoly on the source of marijuana that's available for research, and it's typically not released for study unless you present a proposal to study the harms associated with that drug. And I also, to answer the question, think that the federal government should pass that law as it pertains to states. Wouldn't it be the ultimate irony if the Controlled Substances Act is used as the justification to prevent a state from controlling substances? So yes, I do think that the federal government should allow states to go forward with regulation.
Jesse, you want?
I think the answer is very simple, that the DEA classifies marijuana as a Schedule I drug, which is defined as an article that has no recognized medical use in the United States. And when you've got 16 states and a District of Columbia that say there is a recognized use, to me that just simply requires the DEA to take notice of the fact that this drug, and the opinion of a large percentage of the medical community and a large percentage of the people, believe that it does have a medical purpose. And the easiest thing would be just to reclassify it as a Schedule II drug. I would prefer to have it regulated in terms of quantitative and qualitative analysis. And Mike Cox almost made me have a heart attack this morning when he said you should go to the beer and wine store and buy it, because I'd much rather see it regulated as to qualitative and quantitative potency and distributed by a pharmacist, but of course I'm very biased. And there is studies out, 63% of Michigan pharmacists, independent pharmacists, said they would dispense it if they didn't have to worry about controlled Schedule I status, and that they could quantify and qualify the product.
Okay, we have questions. There's people with microphones in the balcony and here, am I right? We owe the balcony first, because we cut them out the last time, so go ahead.
Yes, there's a professor at Ohio State University, Michelle Alexander, that makes a potent point. She says her grandfather was a slave and could not vote. Her father was subject to Jim Crow and could not vote, and her brother's in jail for marijuana and can't vote. So how is this not, in looking at the disproportionate number of African Americans imprisoned in relation to marijuana, how is this not a discriminatory policy as well as a totally illogical policy?
Who wishes to answer that? Go ahead, sir.
Well, I mean,
We're going to try to do one answer at a time.
You know, there is an issue with all sorts of laws, especially drug laws. I would agree with you with discrimination. You have people that, you know, for example, they're smoking or using other drugs in public because they're part of public housing, and we know that that is disproportionately represented by minorities in many places. And so, by definition, they can't go to their own basement and smoke without fear. They're doing it on the porch and getting caught. So there are obviously structural issues within society that we need to deal with, and also specific issues with certain police departments in certain areas when it comes to race that we should also deal with. But, you know, I think your question is more about all drugs as opposed to just marijuana, given that, again, if you just look at the statistics, for marijuana only, it's not filling our prisons or jails. That's not a, I mean, you know, you could, if it was, you could go to any, I think, college in the country, do a 1 mile radius of apartment buildings, and you'd be able to round up a lot of people just using marijuana, and you could incarcerate them. So if you look at the stats, that's not really a reason why people are in jail. That doesn't discount your point about the disproportionality of certain drug laws, and that's why I don't support mandatory minimums. That's why I supported and urged the administration when I came in to equalize the crack powder disparity. So 100 to 1 is now reduced to 18 to 1. 18 to 1. I argue it should be equal. So there are things that you can do that necessarily wouldn't legalize drugs. One other quick point is that if you talk to the Black Caucus and you talk to other minority groups on this, the last policy they want to endorse is on legalization. And the reason is they've seen how drugs affect their community. So they don't want more drugs in their community, and that is why Charlie Rangel and you know, Elijah Cummings of Baltimore are the architects of most of today's drug laws, prevention, treatment, and enforcement programs. Came from those two gentlemen in the House of Representatives because they see how drugs are affecting their community. Doesn't mean we can't work on those issues that you mentioned, and we should.
You want to make another response?
I want to put the question on the other side. look at the social context. If we are saying we want to now go away from decriminalizing to legalization, so now think about 14-year-olds growing up with Facebook, joint that they can buy in the local store, and the impact. You have to look at this from a corporatization of incarceration in America. It's not marijuana, it's not a specific community. It's total incarceration. Goes back to the Fair Sentencing Act, how crack cocaine and powder cocaine were separated and had the same devastating impact to the black community. So let's look at from a more fundamental aspect as opposed to just a blanket decriminalization.
I'm going to arbitrarily select people, 2 down here, 1 up there, based on intensity. Go ahead, you had a question before.
Can I actually have just a second, Professor, on that last question?
Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick second. You know, for the most part, I agree with Kevin that, you know, what the question relates to is a broader societal structural problem, and it has to do with the war on drugs, not necessarily just marijuana, although obviously marijuana makes up a big part of that. But I did want to address the, you know, the notion that people don't go to jail for marijuana is not true. Like I said, I was a prosecutor before I came to MPP, and I saw plenty of people in jail for just marijuana. Maybe we don't imprison people, but I guess that define imprison. People don't spend years in jail for just marijuana, but they do spend days, they do spend weeks. And, you know, we talked a little bit about parole revocation, and obviously that plays a role too. And, you know, he mentioned that you should talk to the Black Caucus, and I agree wholeheartedly. Talk to John Conyers, talk to Barbara Lee, who are sponsors of bills to end marijuana prohibition in this country. Talk to Neil Franklin, who is a black police officer, spent 30 years as part of the Baltimore police force, and now is the chairman of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. So, you know, you can go either way with that.
This gentleman, who has the mic down here?
Please.
Here we go. Go ahead.
For marijuana possession only? A caregiver. All right. Not,
Okay, let's keep this orderly. Go ahead.
that's cultivation and distribution.
Yes, I heard Kevin and Dan both mention something about, and you, Jesse talked about the gateway effect. There was a report recently about a study released, a 9% reduction in traffic fatalities, a 5% reduction in beer sales in medical marijuana states. Marijuana is not the gateway. Marijuana closes the gate shut for opiate addiction. It's been demonstrated in lab rats, and our online studies right now, we don't have the hard numbers yet, but right now in Michigan, medical marijuana, those respondents, 80% of those who were regularly using opiate pills for pain reduction completely got off of them if they had marijuana available. Why isn't this being considered as a part of public policy? It reduces opiate addiction. It reduces opiate cravings.
Does anyone want to respond?
Could I respond to
Yes,
that?
go ahead.
First of all, I think as I was trying to harp on, marijuana is not a drug. Somebody just talked about illicit drugs, I think it was Sabby, and called marijuana an illicit drug. You also mentioned that cocaine is an illicit drug. Cocaine is legal. It's used all the time in hospitals. It has very specific medical uses. It is not a drug of abuse by designation, by designation as a Schedule I drug. It's a Schedule II drug. It's only a drug of abuse when it's used wrongly.
Do any of the panelists disagree with the contention that marijuana is not a gateway drug, but it's a closure drug?
I think a lot of people, you know, this term, like the term war on drugs, nobody knows what it means anymore.
Substance,
and it's
we
the
should
same
say.
thing with the gateway. I mean, it's meant to mean so many things. I mean, you could actually be in favor of legalization and say that there's a gateway theory, because you could say, well, you know, if we close the underground market for marijuana and make it legal, then we're separating those markets and removing that gateway. So I think if you look at most people who use other illicit controlled substances like heroin and other drugs, most of them have used marijuana. But if you look at the vast majority of those who use marijuana, of course, most of them do not go on to use other drugs. In fact, most people who use marijuana use it once or twice and stop, and there's 100 million Americans who have used it once in their life. Over 90% of them have stopped. So, you know, it depends on the perspective you're looking at. I think it's one of those sort of lightning rod kind of phrases that has lost its meaning, frankly.
Okay, take the microphone
The
back.
opiate doctors are not in
Pick
favor of
somebody
medical
back there.
marijuana. Anyone who's
Whoever's
about
closest to
addiction.
you.
It's just
Then
not.
we'll go back upstairs.
This question is for Dan. Regarding the taxes, I'm a CPA, so I got kind of excited when you were talking about taxes.
Glad somebody did.
I was wondering, for medical use, because we don't pay tax on prescription drugs, if it were to be fully legalized, how would we protect patients from having to pay a tax on something that is medically necessary? You know, some people are dying, so I don't think that if you have a cancer patient, they shouldn't be paying hundreds of dollars a month in taxes, you know.
Yeah. Most states do have sections of their tax code that say if you're using, generally things are subject to a sales tax. However, if it's something that's used for a medical purpose, it's exempt from the sales tax, or a lower sales tax is applied. In terms of how we go about doing that, we should. I don't know exactly the best way. Maybe, just like we do now, you go to a doctor, you get a recommendation or a prescription, some sort of acknowledgement from a physician that you're using for a medical purpose, and that's your ticket to exemption from a sales tax. Obviously there's going to have to be some play in the margins as to how, what conditions you need to have to, be diagnosed with in order to qualify. But yeah, there's a few ways that we can go about doing that. I think that's one easy way.
Michigan does not regulate or does not tax prescription drugs at all. Most medical devices are not taxed at all because of that necessity. And just one other point about this drug issue. Just say no to drugs, I think, was the dumbest thing that we have ever done, because we're telling people say no to drugs and not explaining that we're trying to say no to illicit drugs, when everybody in this room, I suspect, is taking a prescription drug prescribed for a legitimate medical disease. As a pharmacist, I want to say just say yes to drugs. I want to say no to substances that cause harm.
Okay, upstairs. Anybody upstairs who hasn't asked a question yet? If not, move over to that side and pick somebody.
Yes, my question is really directed more to Dr. Vivian Esquire, I guess. You talked about some of the pharmacokinetics of cannabis, referring to the fat attraction, the lipophilic actions of it, and it stores in the body for long periods of time. Can you comment on that in terms of longer lasting effects, particularly as it applies to driving?
Well, there is no question that the THC content that is stored in the fat tissue or the lipids remains with a person from at least 4 weeks upwards of 2 months, and has absolutely no effect, no cerebral or central nervous system effect, which makes it difficult when we have something like a alcohol tester for the policeman can tell that you're inebriated on the spot, whereas if you're using, say, Vicodin or oxycodone, you can only get a toxicological laboratory analysis after the fact. And the problem with THC is it can show up in the blood for upwards of a month or longer after it's been consumed. And so until we can find a methodology of testing the CNS effects, the duration of the CNS effects, we're at a very big disadvantage of using toxicological analysis to make a determination as to whether or not someone is intoxicated or inebriated or high or whatever.
Okay, 2 more questions, one from this side.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm a criminologist and professor at Oakland University. So as researching and teaching in drug policy, this is all very exciting. So, I think really one of the biggest issues here is the scheduling of marijuana. We've talked about that. But, the big question in the room is that what do we do as rescheduling of marijuana is likely not coming anytime soon? I mean, the DEA just, I think for the 3rd time, said no, sort of punted to DHHS and said, well, no, we know this would be problematic. And to your point, cocaine is a Schedule II drug. Meth is a Schedule II drug by virtue of these isolated medicinal uses, but marijuana remains Schedule I. So I see we have 2 options. we can either agitate for change for the rescheduling of marijuana, or if that's not going to happen, what do we do now at the state level?
Do you want to answer that first?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I disagree. I think it will be rescheduled. I think it'll probably be descheduled. I mean, it's just my opinion, but to the extent that I'm an expert on the panel, you'll see an initiative pass in a state to legalize marijuana in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe even this year in Colorado. Polling suggests we're, right around that mark now. Yeah, I understand. And when that happens, you'll see the federal government respond. We talked about that a little bit. The federal government is going to have to take a position on a state legalizing, regulating, taxing marijuana. And so at that point, I think you're likely to see some form of rescheduling or descheduling.
Kevin, you wanted to
So
respond to
I
that?
think there are a lot of myths, and I'm glad this was brought up about the scheduling issue. And in fact, my paper in the law review is talking specifically about scheduling. So the biggest myth is that if you put marijuana on Schedule 2, that tomorrow it can be sold at the dispensary down the street as a product. That's wrong. Cocaine is Schedule 2. That obviously can't be done. You have to have a specific product that's approved by the FDA and is sort of goes through the FDA's exhaustive safety, efficacy, specificity analysis that I'll talk about in the medical part. So that sort of scheduling argument is not really relevant. Now there are parts of marijuana that are scheduled lower, so they can be used for medical use. So the THC pill, Marinol, is a Schedule 3 drug, which means there's accepted medical use. There's also a mimic of that, Sesame, which is a Schedule 2 drug, and other drugs coming up the pike. So the issue is it's not inconsistent that cocaine is Schedule 2, even though it's maybe more harmful, for example, on the heart or on the other parts of the brain than marijuana, because cocaine is used as itself as a product in very specific limited medical circumstances, whereas marijuana, you're talking about the whole plant. You're talking about the 400 chemicals that the doctor talked about earlier. You're talking about all of the cannabinoids, everything in there as a whole is Schedule 1, but an element of that is lower schedule. GHB is the same thing. GHB, the date rape drug, is a Schedule 1 drug, but hold on, I'm not done. But Xyrems, which is an element of GHB, the date rape drug, Xyrems is used for anxiety and for certain narcoleptic conditions. That's a Schedule 3 drug. So it's not inconsistent to think that you would have marijuana's products approved by the FDA as a lower schedule, and you'd keep marijuana as a whole plant material in terms of the smoked, unknown quantities, all the unknown things that we were talking about, as a Schedule 1 drug. So the scheduling, I mean, you make it Schedule 2 tomorrow, doesn't make it legalized for medical purposes.
One final question.
Can I respond
By the way,
to that,
I just one
Go
more
ahead.
thing though, if I
Jesse,
can
go
say,
ahead.
it's not the DEA that determines that. It's binding on the FDA. So it's Health and Human Service Secretary does what we call an 8-factor analysis. It's an exhaustive, hundreds of pages analysis on all the medical literature. They give a recommendation to DEA and the Attorney General that's binding. So it is Kathleen Sebelius and the head of the FDA that does a medical and scientific analysis to see if marijuana or whatever drug has medical use. That's binding on DEA. And by the way, there's a ton of research on Schedule 1 drugs, including marijuana, going on right now. That's not just the research on the negative effects. There's people in California, Don Abrams in San Francisco. There's actually dozens and dozens of studies, happy to furnish them after this, that are looking at the possible medical uses, because as you said earlier, doctor, the cannabinoid system in the brain, our brain and body, produce natural cannabinoids, and we have a natural receptor system to cannabis. It's actually a very exciting area of science. That's very different than legalizing it for somebody who says they have a backache and selling it at a dispensary under the name Super Silver Haze. I mean, that's not medicine, but we can make it medicine.
None of those studies you're talking about are federally funded.
Of course they are. But NIDA provides the marijuana. They are federally funded by NIH. I mean, we have the stats.
They are not studying natural marijuana. Dobronil that you mentioned is exclusively delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. Sure. It has none of the terpenes or the other cannabinoids in it. And just about every physician and just about every patient that you talk to that's ever used Dobronil says it's absolutely worthless.
But we have to redo the research on the other drugs.
One more question.
One thing I'd like to say is
So is
that
willow bark.
Genesis 2.3, God said, I have given you every herb-bearing seed that is good. And marijuana is no different than any other herbs that we use on a daily basis. Secondly, we have not discussed the alcohol issue that has contributed to 80% of domestic violence in our society, 20% of employment issues. That is your gateway drug.
It is a gateway drug.
It's more than that. I think that's a comment. I think we just end on one point.
Yeah, so first of all, I hear that a lot about marijuana is just a plant. Well, like Kevin would say, so is hemlock. It has nothing to do with the fact that it's a plant. There are lots of dangerous plants that's really not pertinent. But the second point about alcohol really is pertinent, because that's one of the real catastrophes of marijuana prohibition, is that we steer people towards alcohol. When you make one product legal and one product illegal, people are more likely to use the one that's legal. A better example of that more recently is with synthetic cannabinoids, K2 and spice, which are clearly more dangerous than marijuana, and yet people are using those because they can't use marijuana, because marijuana would show up on a drug test and those wouldn't. The fact is, if marijuana were legal, those drugs wouldn't even exist. There'd be no need for them. And it sort of goes back to the study that somebody mentioned earlier about you know, using marijuana instead of using alcohol. I'll just quote from the study. The legalization of medical marijuana is associated with a 9% reduction in the mean number of drinks consumed per month by males and a 12% reduction in the mean number of drinks consumed by females. We see beer sales go down by 5%. For somebody like me, like Kevin, like everybody in this room who knows that alcohol is more dangerous than marijuana, we should not be steering people towards alcohol the way we are now.
Can I just comment on that?
It's on this point.
Can I comment on that?
Well, I think we better have some lunch. Unless you all want to cancel lunch and keep going. I suspect the organizers do not. Thank you very much for good questions, and thanks for your response.
Oh, I just want to make a quick announcement about lunch. Those of you who registered for lunch, you will have a green sticker on your name tag, and you can proceed to the McGregor Conference Center, which is, if you exit the atrium to the left, you'll follow right across, so you'll see McGregor Conference Center. For those of you who did not register for lunch, you'll have a red sticker, and I invite you to a local restaurant, and also at 1 p.m. the lunch lecture will be streamed. So you will get a chance to see the lunch lecture in room 1545 in the law school classroom building. If you have any questions, please find a law review member. They can help you.
Licensed staff. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Thank you very much.
That's right, exactly. There's a cultural difference. That's exactly right.
Yeah, sure, I'm going to stop for a second. You said it's out to the left, right?
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah, absolutely. Good, good.
I believe you said that criminalization of marijuana is bad public policy.
You know, like I said there at the end, one of the main reasons why I think it's bad public policy is when you make one substance legal and another substance illegal, people are more likely to use the one that's legal. In this case, we're talking about alcohol. We're steering people towards using alcohol. Marijuana is available as,
and actually, most of the studies,
people
what
would
I
have
want
the
to say,
option to use the safer alternative.
So that's one study out of about 100.
National Office of Drug Control policies say that alcohol is far more dangerous than marijuana. So why do we have policies that steer people towards using that more dangerous substance? Yeah, for any number of reasons. I mean, I could go on and on. For example, when you have marijuana prohibited, it's sold on a black market, so you buy clear plastic bags of green material, and frankly, you have no idea what it is. In a market where it's regulated, just like we have, you buy a product that's labeled for potency.
It would do nothing tomorrow if marijuana was scheduled, other than probably maybe it will increase some bit of research because you don't have to get the Schedule I license. But other than that, which everyone that's applied for Schedule I license has gotten it. So you know, it hasn't been a big barrier. Other than that, cocaine is Schedule II, meth is Schedule II. You can't sell it in dispensaries. It's totally illegal. Right. So in terms of making the whole marijuana plant medicine, that wouldn't, it's maybe a necessary, but certainly not sufficient.
Okay. Thank you. Either one. Yeah, take it. I'm writing.
No, because it's the same as cocaine was Schedule I versus Schedule II would be enforced the exact same way as now. Cocaine just happens to have, as an individualized drug, has those medical value. And parts of marijuana have medical value. Marijuana is medicine. It doesn't necessarily mean that you smoke the whole medicine. Opium is medicine in the form of morphine and a lot of other things. We don't smoke opium. Willow bark is medicine. That's where we get aspirin from. We don't chew willow bark. I mean, that's sure. Thank you. Sure, no problem.
sounds exciting. I wish you best of luck. Because exciting. I used to work in Legal Aid Society of Columbus. I have in felon reentry. Yeah, so it's an issue.
Somebody told me just a few days ago that there's a conference held at the old.
That conflicts. Because there's no acceptance of this other law.
But about 9 times you don't get it, and so they made it.
Perfect, it's already, it's perfect, it's great.
Testing. Test it. We are streaming live on RadioWeedShow.com. Breaking for lunch now. The Wayne State University, this is a symposium on marijuana. We will be back at 1 o'clock. I'm going to try and pick up the Wayne State feed from the luncheon and restream it. For now, we're going to leave the air and join you again at 1 o'clock.